Hi Noah, this is Dr. Bachner. I'm here. How are you? Thanks. Good. This really happened at the last minute for me. I apologize for that. It was, wow, trying to get everything together at the last minute was difficult. Oh, okay. I'll bet you were a little stressed. I know I am slightly, but I'll probably recover shortly. Oh. Okay, and I am. So you're right. That's good. Sure. Great. Thank you. No, it's great to be here. All right, so should I just go ahead and begin? Okay. Okay, sure. Okay, great. Perfect. Well, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about a lot of things that are important in psychotherapy, and everybody thinks about them: empathy and boundaries. Also, something I call emotional space, which is more or less about making sure that it's more about the client than it is about the therapist. And I'm going to talk about a model that I call the relational systems theory. And a lot of people are thinking, I think, especially after they've been practicing for a while, that they don't really want to deal with this theory stuff anymore. But to me, personally, as I was learning psychology, it seemed to me like it was really important to have a theory that sort of pulled everything together. So, you know, like many of us, I started studying psychoanalysis, and I started studying systems theory, and I started studying cognitive therapy, all sorts of different kinds of approaches. And what I notice is that we all are talking about different things when we talk about these different therapies, almost as if they don't really have that much in common. And yet, we're all trying to help people get better, and we're all working with the system of the mind. And so it just seems interesting to me that there wouldn't be a comprehensive model, sort of a unification model. And of course, that that kind of thing has been attempted, but I think that the relational systems model, which is my own model, is extremely helpful. So it's not just about bringing together ideas and having us understand all our different ways of working with clients under one general idea of how the mind works, but it's actually also helpful in working with the client so that you can come up with interventions more quickly, understand things more quickly, and that's kind of what we're going to get at today. I am going to explain the model, which hopefully you'll find interesting. I find it fascinating myself, and I think what you're going to find is that this model comes very close to involving how we experience life, the way it really is, and how we experience our clients' problems or even their solutions in psychotherapy, and it helps lead to those solutions as well. So as part of that, just as a way to jump in, I'd like to say that I think that there's really two kinds of therapists in sort of an in-between model, and I think there's sort of the therapy as art model, which is we go in, we connect to our client, we feel them, which this is all stuff that is really true. I think even if you're working in the most scientific model possible, there's still a very large element of feeling your client and trying to understand what they're getting at, and you using your intuition to do that. And then so there's those models are sort of connected. There's sort of that's more of an existential, humanistic approach. And then on the other side would be more of the models that are relatively easy to prove useful, like cognitive models. And then in between, I think, is psychoanalysis. I think that psychoanalytic models do a lot to sort of act as though there's a science without necessarily showing the science that clearly. And yet, when you look at my model, you're going to say, well, this is clearly connected to psychodynamic theory, and yet it is also obviously also very clearly connected to systems theory, and that's why it is so versatile. But I think what's going to surprise you, and it's going to require that we wait until we get to the end, what's going to surprise you is how really useful it is, because it's not like my experience anyway of reading psychoanalytic models, whether it be object relations or intersubjective or drive models, where you can understand how they're saying a certain problem exists, but you don't understand how they all connect. I think that at least if I successfully do what I want to do today, you are going to see how they do really connect. In that regard, I'm really hoping that all of you received or printed out the handout. There are some diagrams in there that will make it very helpful. I'm going to do my best to explain them, even if you don't have the diagrams, but the diagrams will be very helpful. So let's start out talking about an idea that really started with Freud, and obviously Freud was a genius. At least that's obvious to me. I don't criticize Freud much, but since he was so early on, my view on things is, what could we expect? Did we expect that he actually has a complete model that does everything that we needed to do to really understand how psychotherapy works? And besides that, he was really working primarily on an individual model, and so much of what we do is interpersonal. What could we expect from that? Nevertheless, on the other hand, it seems to me like a lot of therapies have left behind this idea of drive. And so as I was saying earlier, we all sense a feeling of drivenness within us. And you'll notice when you look at my model that I call it drivenness rather than drive. And that's just so that I can get away from the this sort of politicized idea of whether we have drives or not, because I don't really care. What I care about is that we have an experience of drivenness, without a doubt. And I don't think anybody would say they don't have this experience, that we really want something and we work towards it or really try to get it. But I don't think that the drives that Freud posited are exactly how most people perceive life. We all talk about certain things that are very obvious to us, and they are somewhat akin to Freud's drives, and others that came after him, of course, but they're not exactly the same thing. So, for example, obviously, libido is supposed to be a drive. Well, most people do feel a drivenness about sex. There's no doubt about it. And I do think that that's a drivenness, just like I'm going to say that the things that I'm going to talk about are drivenness, but really this particular kind of drivenness usually doesn't develop until a little bit later in life. I mean, let's say at least 8 in most people, unless you're a little early, which also happens. I'm not somebody who says that anything happens exactly at one time and only one time. And then it also, for most people, dissipates in the older years. So to me, calling that a drive, I don't know, seems to me like we don't really experience that as a drive in the same way we do as 2 other really important factors. And one of them is really Freud's other drive, except I think he left half of it off, and that drive is the aggressive drive. Now, what I call the aggressive drive, as you'll see when you look a little bit closer, is I call that self-protection. Why do I do that? Because it's not just aggression, it's also obviously fear. In any kind of scientific research, or when we try to teach our clients relaxation, we talk about undoing both aggression and fear with relaxation. And these things are sort of, can be thought of as being opposites. We either run away or we fight. And there's also, hiding, which we do a lot of hiding too, but that's sort of on the same continuum. Especially human beings do a lot of hiding. I think that's what we do more than anything else, is try to hide how we're really feeling. So when you look at my 3 continua, this would be in figure 1, you'll see that the second one is self-protection. I could have done sustenance first, but I'm doing self-protection first just because it is one of Freud's drives. And you'll see that on the 2 sides you have the things that are more related to aggression on the left side and things that are more related to fear on the right side. And some of you might be somewhat uncomfortable with where my ends of the drives go, but I consider these continua, they have to get to a place where things are really, really, really bad. So to me, at the very end of the continuum for self-protection and the fear side, you'd have fear sort of close to the center. Then you'd have something more like horror. It doesn't even matter what these words are. They're just whatever you think of as being more and more and more. And then towards the end, I have sort of an annihilation of the self. That would be almost like a shrinking to nothingness. I mean, we shrink from fear, and this would be like shrinking to nothingness, like we don't even exist anymore. We're so afraid. We make ourselves very small. We don't even want to be there. To me, that's the very end of that continuum. On the other side, you have just your regular old anger, which is relatively normal. That's towards the center. Then you have aggression, then you have destruction, and then you might have destruction of everything. And we find people when they become psychotic, whether it be just people who want to destroy everything, the Unabomber, anybody else. Some people actually experience this extreme fear and then actually try to have plans for doing it. Well, this is the very extreme of that continuum. And I think from my experience, and I think from typical experience of most people, we do kind of either say, well, we're either afraid, then we get very afraid, we get extremely afraid, and then I'm not so sure everybody would agree, we get to a point where we can also almost think of ourselves as shrinking to nothingness because we don't want to have to deal with something at all. On the other side, we might increasingly get aggressive until we start fighting, and then we might even get to the point where if we were really reaching a psychotic level, we might want to destroy everything. So to me, that's a better way to describe an aggressive drive than it is to simply say it's aggression. Then we have, at least we have both sides of a continuum. Another primary continuum, I think we really have 2 primary continua, and then the third is something that makes us develop and grow interpersonally. But the other primary drive, which I think that people will identify with, is sustenance. Now, why do I call it sustenance instead of either libido or just hunger? Libido is more like a hunger, I think, than it is starving. But I think that on one side of this, we could experience ourselves as so starved that we absolutely, we're going to die from starvation. On the other side of this continuum, we can, this is another, sort of just my own possibly controversial way of stating something that would be, if we ate so much of something that we almost become the thing we're eating, that's sort of a merger. So, of course, anybody who's read literature on borderlines, for example, they could see this as, on one side, being sort of an abandonment and an emptiness interpersonally, and on the other side, a merger or an absorption. Those kinds of things make sense when you're thinking about the borderline personality, and many of you probably have read quite a bit about that. Closer to the center, which is more of a balance or a feeling of confidence, or just not really needing anything, you have just a little bit of hunger on one side, which you could satisfy, or satisfaction on the other side, which means you have been satisfied a little bit. And what I'm really saying is that what we do, in my opinion, is that we symbolize almost all of our experience based on these three continua. I haven't talked about the relatedness yet, but so I'm not saying exactly that hunger for food is the same thing as hunger for another person, but I think that hunger for another person or desire is symbolized similarly in the mind as is hunger for food. Now, hunger for food and starvation, these are actually elemental things that we need to survive. Same thing with the self-protection continuum. We're either going to run away. I mean, if we were in the animal kingdom and we were being pursued by a lion or something like that, we would either run away, or if it actually grabbed us, we would have to fight for our lives. So these are really the elemental core things that keep us going, and yet we symbolize everything based on these core continua. They're very much like drives in that they cause drivenness. And it's really hard for me to imagine anybody would disagree with the fact that these cause drivenness in us. Now, when we come from relatively good circumstances, of course, just like anybody else, I would say that nobody has perfect circumstances, but the more positive your circumstances are as a child, the more likely you are to develop into the relatedness realm. The relatedness realm kind of adds a third dimension. You'll see that in my next figure, that I actually posit these things in an X, Y, and Z continua. If you can imagine that, if you're not looking at it on the next page, then you can imagine when you've taken math classes, when you had to figure these things out, you had an X, Y, and Z continua. So you only have two dimensions if you have the self-protection continuum and the sustenance continuum. But when you have relatedness, you are now developing depth. And we experience our clients as having more or less depth based on whether they've developed more or less relatedness. So to me, that also just sort of makes sense. Now, the relatedness continuum, towards the center you have sharing on the right side, towards responsibility. You want to share. And on the left side of the continuum, away from absolute balance, is just a simple desire that you could solve. Interpersonally, you solve this by meeting up with a person and wanting to talk with them, or hugging your mother or your child. And on, in sharing, you give your child things, or you give presents, and it feels good. And these are relatively balanced emotions. Nothing is ever static. If there's a balance towards the middle, as you see my middle line, through all three continua, that balance doesn't mean that it's static and you stay there and you're absolutely perfectly balanced. But as you try to gain that, you feel more and more. Now, it could seem a little confusing that these continua go out towards the edges where the extremes are, and that I'm saying balance is towards the center, and yet I'm also talking about depth. But you'll see also in my diagram after the second diagram, that I talk about a way of talking about depth where it actually looks like that in the diagram. Anyway, so relatedness is on a continuum also. And what we are trying to avoid when we are related is absolute isolation. That's at one end. So there's no one about, from my own point of view, for example, even a hermit in a cave who's decided to sequester himself for 20 years is not really all the way alone. He's about as alone as he could get, but he's sort of now defined himself interpersonally as being alone, and that is a way of being with people as well. True, horrible isolation that we all dread would be that there isn't anyone at all. They don't exist, and we're completely alone. I think that at the ends of the relatedness continuum, that is what we truly fear. On the other end, and this is something that is much easier for people to truly grasp and understand, is the idea of responsibility fragmentation, especially for people who try to be very good, which is many of us. We sometimes take on so many responsibilities, or even in some of our clients especially, will notice that they're trying to be so good that they don't want to disappoint anyone ever, that they become completely fragmented in the idea that they don't have any needs anymore. It's only the needs of everyone else around them. So these are the ways in which we reach extremes, and you'll also notice if you look at this continuum that closer to the center is simple loss on the isolation side, simple loss, and then loneliness, and all the way down to isolation. Again, the words themselves don't matter that much. They could be any words that you think of that give you a sense that it's more and more and more. On the right side of the continuum, you have first, as I had mentioned before, just simple sharing, and then you have a sense of responsibility. Then if you don't, if you're meeting your responsibilities, but like many of us, you don't think you're doing quite good enough, then you might feel guilt. And then if you're doing too much for too many people all the time, you can feel fragmented with responsibility. You'll also notice that when you think about all three of these continua, that we all experience things in all three. I do not believe, just like I was saying, that we don't reach an absolute center, that we ever completely 100% solve any of these problems. And that's just simply part of being alive. We will always have some kind of desire and hunger, and that's actually what we need that in order to achieve. We will also have some fears and some need to assert ourselves, and some, to the extent that asserting yourself is a little bit of aggression. I think that you need that. You also will always, I think it's a good thing to be someone who takes responsibility, and that you should feel loss. You really don't want that static point in the middle. There is no absolute balance. There's just a relative balance that makes you less and less likely to have extreme emotions. So the more balanced you are, the more healthy you are, the more balanced you are. As an aside, and this is really not part of this presentation, I just want to mention that I also believe, as I think that most of you would think is true, that genetically, even if we don't consider nurture at all, genetically different people have different capacities for balancing these things. There are going to be people who are born with more intensity. There are going to be people who are actually born with more of a sense of connectedness to others. And to the extent that you are born with more connectedness, you are probably going to use relationships to balance yourself, which will help you get more related. To the extent that you are more intense, and it could be on more than one of these scales or only one of them, to the extent that you are more intense, the harder it is going to be for you to balance. So it's not just a matter of nature and nurture, it's also a matter of what you're born with, of course. So we have people who have told me that they disagree with my sense of what a bipolar disorder person has. And if you look into my latest book, you'll see that my diagnosis of bipolar disorder primarily is based on intensity. And so there are really, now in common therapy these days, there are really two kinds of people who get diagnosed with bipolar. Those are people who have personality disorders on the one hand, and there are people who really, you can see that they take lots of responsibility and deal with lots of guilt, and they still have a hard time managing all of their intensity. A lot of those people really do have a genetic level of bipolar disorder, and they are the classic kind of bipolar. That intensity they have a difficult time handling, even if they have had good nurturing. And you will also find that, of course, if it's genetic, there's more chance that they had people who were very intense in their families, which means that there's a good chance that the nurturing was somewhat interrupted in their family if they have intensity. So it can be both. They can have personality attributes that come from how they were raised. They can also have a genetic level that comes from how intense they were, or they can have a person who was trying to be nurturing, but it was also intense. And all of these things get mixed up, and it's very difficult to differentiate them, but we look for them obviously in our initial assessment. We look for how a person has been raised, we look for what happened in their families, And then we slowly try to see how they're working in the world now. And all of this we put together, and we try to help them get to where they need to be. So looking at figure 2, you'll notice that I did put them in 3 dimensions. It might not be that easy to see that that dotted line is a 3rd dimension. So I have in figure 2, for those of you who don't have the packet, I have the sustenance continuum running from left to right. I have the self-protection continuum running from top to bottom, and then running through them, and hopefully that you can see it's a 3rd dimension, I have the relatedness continuum. And the reason why I put them this way is because I envision them as actually being orthogonal. I don't know if you'll remember your statistics that well, but orthogonal means that they are would be considered, although I haven't done a statistical analysis on these, they would be considered completely separate factors, even if they do relate to each other in some ways. They are different enough to be completely different factors, so I think that they can be presented as though perpendicular to one another. Now moving on to what's on figure 3, you'll see that I've done something that makes understanding the depth much easier. And what we're going to talk about here a little bit is boundaries before I get into exactly how this helps in understanding patients and how we can work with diagnosis and empathy and countertransference. What I've done here is I've turned these continua inside out, and I know that that's, it's one of those things that when you first look at it, it hurts your brain. Like when you took your calculus exams and you had to rack your brain for hours on these really difficult, at least it was difficult for me, tests, or it actually got difficult much before then. And your brain hurts by the end. It's not that easy to see this at first. But when I explain to you why it's important to have these things depicted in 3 dimensions, it will make sense. And that is, intensity is perceived by us as coming from the inside. We use what everybody is calling repression to push down intense feelings, and to the extent that we can repress our feelings, we feel that we're not that much aware of them. So when these 3 continua are presented inside out, you notice that I have an inside ball and an outside ball. The inside ball would be considered an internal boundary, and the outside ball would be considered an external boundary. The internal boundary holds in the extremes of emotion. And as I had been saying earlier, we don't ever really get rid of these all the way. What we do is we develop our own ability to nurture ourselves and to calm ourselves through what we're given in our environments. And that helps us calm these things down deep within ourselves. So most people never really ever experience this idea that they want to destroy the world. I know I have not actually experienced that directly. They don't ever want to completely be in merger with other ones all the way, and they don't want to have any of the extremes of experience. It is much more likely that we will feel isolated or feel responsibility fragmented, because those are more related ideas, and we are more comfortable the more an emotion involves relatedness. So if you look at this diagram, you'll see that now I have them inside out, and I consider us as having 2 boundaries. Really, we have an internal boundary that separates our most drastic and intense emotions from our conscious awareness. And then we have an external boundary that governs what we allow others to see and what we put into our impressions of others. I'm not going to get far into this idea of how flexible or permeable these 2 boundaries are, but you can imagine that how permeable or flexible the 2 boundaries are has a lot to do with how intense the feelings are and how much we have been allowed to develop those boundaries through our relationships with others. Just as an aside here, I think it's interesting to note that when I meet a client who has been diagnosed with some very intense thing, like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and with one person in mind in particular, he had a diagnosis of bipolar and schizophrenia, and he wanted to know what this really meant. How can he really be bipolar and schizophrenic? And so I was actually able to explain this model to him in a relatively simple way. He was a very intelligent man, though. But I was able to explain it in a relatively simple way, and he felt like for the first time ever, either this or he was just shining me on, which is always a possibility in our profession. He was saying that for the first time he truly understood what people were talking about, which I think understanding always helps. We do like people to understand. And he had been given mood stabilizers, which is often the case, to help him with his schizophrenia and with his bipolar disorder. And what I explained to him was that both could be true, because he was trying to manage a certain level of intensity that for him was very hard to imagine, and then he would start to use psychotic processes as a way of protecting himself, which I know that they don't sound like they protect you because they're very, very harrowing. But you could read my article on psychotic disorder in my newest book, and you would also see that I say there that this is very harrowing, and the only thing that would make a person use these extreme defenses against, for any particular reason, would be that what they really are afraid of is getting to a point where they actually either want to completely destroy the world, or they're defending against the idea that they would completely be absorbed into the world, or would be completely annihilated, or something at one of the extremes of the continua. And then they would use, this idea that they're part of a plot that actually helps to defend them, sort of, because it's helping them to make sense of it, as opposed to it's just an extreme fear of everything being as horrible as it could possibly be. So they could use a paranoia, or they could use actually, these voices when they have this idea that the voice is telling them to do something that lets them not have to take full responsibility within themselves when they're experiencing. I know many of you will not agree with this way of seeing psychotic processes, but they have to do with intense emotions. And I'm not at all saying that anybody who is schizophrenic also has bipolar disorder. I'm just saying that a schizophrenic has very intense emotions that they are trying to hold down. As a matter of fact, the thing about psychotic process is that, getting back to this boundaries idea, they do have relatively impermeable boundaries, a psychotic person usually, and they have very strong senses of right and wrong a lot of times. Not that they necessarily follow it, but because they have such extreme senses of right and wrong, and such an impermeable internal boundary, these things can get further out of control, and they partly happen because the person has such a rigid system. I think many of you will believe or understand how that occurs in your patients who have psychotic processes. Now, the external boundary is the one that we're much more aware of. As a matter of fact, when we talk about having good or bad boundaries, we're usually talking about this external boundary. Somebody affects us, and to the extent that they're affecting us in a way that we don't want to be affected, we have good boundaries by letting them know. So the to the extent that they are affecting us with their bad boundaries, without them knowing it, then they have bad boundaries. There is a time when we're supposed to have an effect and we want to have influence, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. But if we're using it to exploit others, that's when it's really a problem, or when we are trying to get our way in an aggressive manner, that's when it's a problem. But to get back to this overall thing, so that it has how to, what impression do we create on others? This boundary can also be rather either rigid or more or less permeable or impermeable, and it has to do with how much we allow ourselves to show the world who we really are, and it also helps us share with the world when we are needy. We go to the people who it's appropriate to have need with, because they make us feel safe, and we share our needs, and then they help nurture us, and we can actually give that back to them if we're relatively healthy people. And to the extent that you are a truly authentic person and can be very spontaneous, in a way you can think of the internal boundary slowly, with more health, coming up to meet the external boundary. At some point, you can show all the stuff you have on the inside, because it no longer scares you, to the world, and you can show them that you're real and that you have true feelings, and you're not afraid that they might be disappointed or might judge you. You're not afraid that they might reject you, because you can meet your needs in the world and on your own, and you're relatively healthy, and so you're spontaneous and authentic. And the internal boundary comes up to meet the external boundary, and you start feeling more like your true self. That's becoming your true self all the way. Okay, so I think this would be a good time to take some questions, Noah, and then I'll get into more of how this affects therapy. Give me a second to breathe, which is always nice. Maybe even have a sip of my water. I am concerned that this is very hard for people to make sense of without the diagrams, but I'm hopefully doing an adequate job. I'm not quite sure. Hello? Hi. Okay, I think that's a fantastic question. Thank you for that question, Barb. So when we're really afraid of ourselves, we have this internal boundary, and we're pushing things down. So this idea of repression, I don't know how many of you actually feel like you experience repression as a pushing down. And actually, even in myself, I'm not really sure if I started experiencing it that way after learning about it, or if I already experienced it that way as a person. There's this feeling that you're pushing things down because you don't really feel comfortable with anyone knowing about that particular thing. So even for healthy people, even for myself, I get very unsure about whether something about me is okay or not okay. I sure do wish that I could say I was a totally confident, spontaneous, authentic person all the time, and that I was completely sure that everything about me was okay, but that just simply would not be the truth. And I don't feel like I've met very many people where that is the truth. And so what has to happen is you gain confidence in your relatedness, you gain confidence in your own ability to take care of yourself through better interactions with people. And for example, with a client, simple things like teaching assertiveness. I did provide 4 different articles in the back of my packet, but not assertiveness. But for example, in assertiveness, the person, we all have clients who really have a hard time asking for what they want or need. Some of them think that they're being selfish if they do it, whereas I would really only think it's selfish if they're saying, I have to have my way and it's going to be my way. That I think is selfish. But asking for what you want and then being willing to put it out there and weigh your own needs equally with others, I don't think that is selfish. So a person works on assertiveness, they talk more about what they need and what they want, and they share more, and then they don't need repression as much because they don't need to hide it from themselves, and they also don't need to hide it from others. There's a way in which the internal boundary actually is a way of even hiding it from yourself because it threatens you. So, and this is a common thing to find with clients all the time. You see clients and they weren't even aware that they were feeling a certain way. I don't know, it could be anything. I hate to do the just something that's just such a canned example, but so a person always thought that this is sort of a your typical example, so I apologize for that, but you meet a person who feels like their father is the greatest person ever, and they've always done everything they could to please their father, and in a session, all of a sudden they come up with this overwhelming anger towards their own father, or hatred, and they don't even know where it's coming from. This was something that was repressed because it was threatening to them. They thought their father was wonderful, and usually the truth is somewhere in between. Their father probably was wonderful, at least a lot of times, and a good leader to them. And now this thing that they've repressed before, either because of their comfort with the therapist or because of their own willingness to share something that they had been very uncomfortable with previously, this now is something they share because it becomes possible for them to deal with it. They can now have this idea be no longer repressed. It comes into awareness, and they even share it with the therapist all at the same time. Sometimes we just become aware of something, we don't share it with anyone, and that also is a way in which that internal boundary was more permeable at that moment and allowed something into awareness. I hope that helps. I don't know if Barb is still there. Did that help, Barb? I think she signed off. Yeah. I would be glad to take another question, and then I'll be glad to move on as well. Hello? Oh, wow, we don't want to cancel. I do think that both are equally true. What is ideal, of course, is that the therapist has done more work on this than the client. And really, you will hear me state in our next section that I think that the mental health of the therapist is extremely important in psychotherapy. I don't believe it's true that the therapist is likely to have 100% health, but the healthier the better, and the healthier the therapist is, the more likely he is able to not only express himself genuinely and spontaneously and authentically, although not sharing more of himself than is good for the client, and of course that's hard to sense sometimes. But at the same time, I think it's important for the therapist to be relatively healthy already, if that makes any sense. I sort of, like most of us, sort of lost a part of my thought and it didn't come back, so I apologize for that. I'm still here, yes? I do agree with that. I mean, I think the thing to be careful about is that I'm not saying anything against any particular style of working with a client, but I am saying that that the therapist, the healthier the therapist becomes, the more he is able to use the fact that he's healthy in working with the client, and that sometimes involves sharing as well, at least for some therapists. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right. Thank you. So if there's not anybody else, I think it's a good time for me to continue. Are we good, Noah? Okay. All right. So it's interesting that our last question had to do with this particular area. Because I do have certain ideas about transference, and it has a lot to do with what happens in therapy. Transference proper, I think the way that it's mostly talked about is in a psychoanalytic therapy, where a patient, at least in the classical sense, is truly projecting this idea of someone else or other people they've experienced on the therapist. And I also do agree that the less active the therapist it is, the more likely that this transference is coming purely from the client. But I also think that transference is extremely important in any therapy, and I think that all of you will also recognize this idea that your clients are going throughout their lives perceiving things a certain way based on how they've been treated in their lives and how they've always perceived things before and how things have gone for them. Now, some people might say that that's too general of a definition of transference. Nevertheless, that is my definition of transference. And part of that is because I'm a relatively active therapist. I'm not saying, at least I'm hoping that when I am relatively active, that I'm not getting in the client's way. That is always debatable. One of the problems with being an active therapist is that it opens up everything that you're doing for more question. You're doing more, so the more of what you're doing is open for questioning. But to me, there's this way in which, if you are active, you actually work with a more useful part of the transference. This is very easily debatable because it all depends on what's useful. But one of the things about me saying this is that really, as we know, there are very, very few patients now, or clients, who are going to be able to work with a therapist 3 days a week in the classic analytic style, or even more days a week than that. So it's more likely that more therapists are being more active. At least that's what I believe. That's what I hear from all my colleagues. I also do believe that this part of transfer that you're seeing, the way they're perceiving you, the way they're going to act with you because of what they assume about you, is very common in their lives, and it's happening all the time. And so I think it's really extremely useful to work with. The thing is, just like it would be with any kind of transference, they don't believe they're seeing you a certain way. They think that they are seeing you as you are. And to the extent that you also have a countertransference reaction to them, and to the extent that that countertransference reaction involves something that's inaccurate, I believe that there are accurate countertransference reactions, which many of you probably also believe. But the extent to that it's accurate, you're picking about them, but to the extent that it's not accurate, it's your own way of seeing the world yourself. In fact, I don't know if this, I think this is something that helps me at the same time that it can also be a problem sometimes, but I think that something that I have to watch out with clients is that I am too likely to see their positive too quickly, which, it's kind of a strength also, but I believe we need to see the best in each other all the time, and I think that comes to bear in my therapy. Is that a countertransference reaction that actually is not something that's true? I don't really know, because I still see the world that way. I still see the world in terms of if a client is even doing terrible things, I see that client in terms of doing those things because of pain. I do not see it as being because they are evil. I see it maybe as because they are animalistic, as we all are, and they haven't balanced those extreme feelings enough based on either those feelings were too intense in the first place, or because they didn't receive the kind of nurturance that would lead them to balance those extreme feelings, and now they might even do terrible things. I don't see them as being just inherently evil. So even if I met a patient who was completely sociopathic, it would be very, very difficult for me to not project something positive. But I'm aware of that in myself, and I do it, and I sometimes even do have to confront myself about it. Okay, so maybe I'm getting a little bit far afield. The main point here is that whether you're active or not active really doesn't have anything to do with whether this model is useful. It also, in my opinion, doesn't really have anything to do with whether transference is useful. Transference is just simply useful in a different way in a less active therapy. And it's if clients are working on things that are something that occurs in their lives all the time and has to do with how they perceive things all the time, the way that transference expresses itself in your therapy office is going to come out even when you're relatively active. Okay, so now I'm sort of over. I'm sort of done talking about boundaries. It'll probably come back up again. But what I'd like to also point out is that in my latest book, which I'm mentioning, this book is really my way of talking about all of the things that come up most in psychotherapy in a relatively obvious way most of the time. So of course it doesn't have everything in it. I actually am a person who's much more likely to be critical about myself than I am a person to point out something positive. Maybe I should work on that. But either way, I'm going to tell you, my latest book is really good. I think that your clients will find it useful. and you will also find it useful in working with them. It has things that you could give them to help them, and ways of describing their patterns that are not insulting, and show them new ways of developing past them. And it also gives you your basic stuff like how to breathe better for health, or work with your children. Anyway, okay, so it's just a short plug on the book. The book really is very good, even though I'm more likely to not think that the things that I do are that great. Okay, so the idea of emotional space comes into play here. And so the way I'm using the concept of emotional space is to say that to the extent that emotions are intense or expressed intensely, sometimes this only means that a person does a lot of talking, but even if they seem not to be especially intense, they're taking up most of the room. So this does have something to do with boundaries, especially with clients. The more that we speak, the less likely that it is that they have a chance to say what they want to say, of course. At home, how emotional space usually works is you'll find one client married to another client, and the client who has big emotions seems to get their way a lot. Now, big emotions can sometimes be hurt. It doesn't necessarily have to be aggression, but it can be hurt emotions or sad emotions. And those emotions take up most of the relationship, while the other person simply accommodates to those emotions most of the time. That person is making their emotions small. They're taking up much less space with their emotions. And yet, their emotions probably affect them as much as do the emotions of the other person. The other person is just reaching their equilibrium in a different way. The person with the big emotions uses their equilibrium to uses their emotions to create the equilibrium for themselves. They start feeling very intense, very strong feelings, and then they either cry or burst out with some kind of outburst. The other person may need to go be alone for a while so that they can go back to their equilibrium as they have become somewhat overwhelmed or fragmented, or even if they've felt somewhat isolated, they may need to relate in a completely positive way with somebody just so they can start feeling better again. So I've written another article. What I was going to say is at the end of this packet, there are articles. One is Understanding Boundaries. That's an article from the book that is meant for clients, even though you'll also see my model in it. And then I have an article called Emotional Space as the second article in the packet, which explains, it's mostly about how children take up too much emotional space sometimes, and it's okay for parents to have emotions with children, not to get outrageous. It's not to the point where everything has to be about the adult, but it's okay for adults to have, or parents to have emotions with their children, so that their children will know where they are. There's some people who are so controlled their emotions, their children will try them and try them and try them and never even know when it is that they've crossed their parent's boundary, because the parent doesn't show that boundary in any particular way. They're managing themselves almost too well. So another thing that has to come across when we're talking about this idea of emotional space gets into what we were talking about. I was telling you that my model is an intrapsychic and interpersonal model. So how do we really make this interpersonal, and how do we really communicate interpersonally beyond language? So we like to say that we use language to express ourselves in the most accurate way possible so other people will understand us, and this is how we interact with others. But we know as therapists that this is really not the way it happens a lot of the time. What we do is our emotions get too intense in some way or another, and we either overexpress them or express them just the right amount. So if we look back at the three continua, you will notice that we will express ourselves with sharing when we just are feeling a little bit of a sense of needing to be related. And we might just go off by ourselves a little bit if we're feeling like we need to be a little bit isolated. And those are sort of a communication pattern. If we are feeling especially desirous of something, it does not necessarily mean another person, but it can mean another person. It can mean desirous of food, it can be drink. Then when it's another person or a certain aspect of another person, then we can express a desire for it either simply by how we behave or by asking for it in words. Same thing with when we get upset about something, we might express some aggression, or we might even withdraw within ourselves and become more fearful when we actually need something. So these things actually, these strong senses of drivenness that I was talking about earlier that exist upon a continuum, the more that they bubble up within you, the more they seek expression, and then they become interpersonal. At less healthy levels, you see people expressing these feelings more intensely, taking up more emotional space, and then you will see that the people that they relate to generally take up the other side. And this is going to help us understand how countertransference works in just a moment, or how even empathy works with some clients. That is to say, if a person acts too strongly in one way, that behavior influences us, and we feel it, and we can start to understand that that is the feeling that they are projecting, and they are acting a certain way to compensate or make up for the other side. So if we're hungry, we eat. If we're desirous for a person, which is, at least in my model, it is showing a way that we are that we are hungry, then we, if we're desirous, we do some sharing, or if it's stronger than that, we go even further. We might start taking more responsibility for somebody if we're feeling kind of isolated. That helps us be more with people. So I'm not sure if this is really making that much sense to you, but the stronger the feeling is, the more likely it comes out in a way that crosses boundaries. It's not really, if it comes out in a way where you express it with just feeling, as opposed to more of a feeling that the other person is threatened or that they better react to you, then that's actually appropriate boundaries. It's just you're expressing your true self, and the other person recognizes it, and they want to come to your aid, and it's expressed well. On the other hand, people can be forced into another position when too much influence is used, and that's when the emotions are too intense. So to me, that is simply something that makes sense, but I'm not 100% sure that everybody would get that. So it becomes, the model becomes interpersonal to the level that these internal continua require expression. Now, some of this is going to be within the internal boundary, and some is going to be in the external boundary. To the extent that we're aware of it, it's already in the external boundary. So somebody might fight to control something because they need it so badly. That means that they are very, very hungry, almost starving for that thing, so they reach out to truly control the other side. The controlling allows them to feel like they've satisfied that hunger. Also, the controlling usually has some sense of aggression to it, and that helps them feel like they are not weak. So to me, these are just things that we see all the time and make a lot of sense. Now, getting on to the subject of empathy, we all know that the typical kind of empathy that we all use is your simple identification with the client. The client says something. You understand that because you can put yourself in their shoes, and then you can use that empathy either quietly to understand them or to actually make a statement that shows that you have that empathy. That gives them a great feeling that you're with them, that you truly understand. To the extent that the empathy is accurate, makes them feel like you're with them and that you understand. But there are other ways of showing an empathic response. And one of the great things about this model is that it points very directly to ways to have authentic, empathic responses which start out as a negative countertransference reaction. And so we've all read about this in a variety of ways. Analytic therapists talk about this, not analytic as in Jungian, but psychoanalytic therapists talk about this all the time. Especially object relations therapists. But I think that if you look at the model here, you'll notice that it's far more simple if you can just see how it works in the model. So you'd have to go back to the second figure, the figure where I have 3 dimensions, to see this. And for most of what I'm going to talk about, you merely only need the first 2 dimensions. And to have them presented as though they are orthogonal to each other actually helps. So for example, most of you have experienced, well actually all of you have experienced a narcissistic person, whether you've actually experienced them within psychotherapy or whether you've experienced them in your lives. A narcissistic person can be thought of as a person who feels a lot of experiences a lot of feelings of weakness and hunger based on their early childhood development, where a lot of times it's at least speculated, and I found this to be true, it is speculated that they have really been there for the needs of somebody else rather than getting nurturing for who they were themselves, and they had to be a certain way in order to get attention, and then they were bolstered very strongly as being really wonderful when they did the things that made the parenting figure feel good about themselves. And so they weren't recognized for having any weakness. That was, when they were weak, they were told that they were weak, and that made them feel worse, as opposed to being nurtured when they're weak. And when they were hungry for affection, they were only given real feelings that they were okay when they did what the other person wanted. So I know that that is a very brief recap of the development of a narcissistic personality. Nevertheless, if they come into the therapeutic situation, many times, and actually it's less likely to happen in the therapy situation than it is in their regular lives, they're very likely to project a feeling of, well, I write it here, and this is probably very unpolitically correct, I write it as being sort of a loser. There's more than one thing. As a matter of fact, early on in therapy, it's much more likely that you'll feel what Kohut called the twinship transference, and that is, it's much more safe, I think, for a narcissistic person to initially believe that you are just as great as them, and then both of you are equally great. This happens towards the beginning a lot. That's a lot safer, and then really it's good to recognize that as well. But at that point, they're not really making up for their biggest weaknesses. They're merely doing something that they do in their daily lives all the time, which is to look for other people who are just as great as them to associate themselves with. As therapy moves along, however, and actually this happens even early on sometimes, they can project this feeling of being a loser into even the therapist. And they're doing it with other people in their lives a lot of the time. So they will either act as though you may be not quite as strong as them, not quite as accomplished as them, that you don't do well enough, all the things that they may have felt as a young child which made them act the opposite way. This is a very delicate thing to handle with a narcissist, as you all know. It's not, you have to wait for a proper time to make this kind of empathic response, but it can help simply to hold on to it. It's easier actually to talk about the twinship transference, and you can merely allow the person to slowly see who you are, at the same time lightly but not defensively, making sure that they don't see you as weak and vulnerable as they may have a desire to see you. So you don't have to, you hold on to your own strength and your own ability and your own confidence in yourself, while slowly allowing them to start seeing the reality of who you are. So again, we're working with this transference thing, but we're being very careful. And the reason why we have to be very careful is because if we make a countertransference interpretation quickly, it's very easy for the person to immediately snap back into defense because they very badly need to be seen as great. However, at the same time, being seen as great does not actually help them. They're there because this becomes a problem for them in their lives. They might come because they did reach a level of fragmentation. You'll notice that narcissists sometimes, especially successful narcissists, will get fragmented very easily with doing many things to be great, but not having the core ability to hold themselves together. But this can happen very easily, and if they're using you to hold themselves together, then you saying something that doesn't fit with their vision of you can lead to them fragmenting to some extent. So you have to be careful, but it helps quite a bit for you to simply hold on to it. This doesn't necessarily mean that you are not being active at all. It just means that you're experiencing this. You are because you are remaining confident in yourself and your own abilities, that when you have an intervention, when you actually say something, it does not fit with a picture of you being a loser in any way. It just it's relatively neutral but confident, and it slowly allows them to see who you really are. And as you've often seen in reading about treatment of narcissists, it also is very, very important when you have been unempathic in some way, which it can happen because you've made an accurate interpretation that they were not ready for. That could be very unempathic, and it can happen just because you're wrong. With narcissists especially, the way in which you genuinely apologize for hurting them and not seeing how hurtful something you said might be to them actually helps a great deal in them starting to see you as a real person, because at that moment you have this wonderful opportunity to not do what everybody else does with them, which is either to withdraw or become aggressive, or what their parent did, which would be to either not recognize their importance, or and I mean their internal importance as opposed to the importance they project by being so great. What you manage to do is you get to see them to see the real you, that you're a person who can see their vulnerability and honor it, and not beat up on them and not think they're bad. And that's actually a fine opportunity. Main point being here about the narcissist is that you can start to experience this projection, or more properly called the projective identification, of being a loser. Hold on to it, and by holding on to it and not allowing it to make you defensive or react too quickly, or to make an interpretation too quickly, it actually helps them quite a bit. Now, I wanted to actually bring up the case of obsessive clients, because as we all know, they're much less likely to have a countertransference. You're much less likely to have a countertransference reaction with them that seems like they are influencing you. One of the things that happens, the healthier a person is, the less, as most of you have read, the less they seem to come over on your side and be taking hold of you. And what I call, my simple way of looking at that is, they are less likely to be having influence with their personality. Nevertheless, there are certain things that even relatively healthy people do. And you know, it's interesting that we have these personality disorder labels for certain things, like the obsessive-compulsive personality disorder is very common, and we need a name for it, but these are actually relatively healthy people. You also will, and the reason why is because they're using repression as their primary defense, as opposed to projective identification and splitting. You know, before I was talking about, they put the feeling, a narcissist puts the feeling into you, the borderline puts the feeling into you, and that's sort of using a lot of influence. I think that I failed to say, if you look at the fourth diagram, you'll notice when I said that you put the two continua together, then you come up with diagrams that actually can be used to map out personalities in the simplest way. So for example, if you look at the narcissistic personality, I have it depicted as there's the two continua flat on the page, left to right being sustenance, top to bottom being the self-protection continuum, and you will see that there's an arrow pointed to the top right in between, and that's my way of showing that the two primary things that the narcissist is defending against is extreme fear or vulnerability on the bottom side of the self-protection continuum, and extreme hunger or need for other people's recognition or pleasing others, a need for that all the way on the left. And so it rises up, and the arrow points how they mostly act. So they mostly act as though they've been sated and they need no one on the sustenance continuum, and they mostly act somewhat aggressive, like they have no vulnerability and they're totally tough. It's a very easy way to diagram them. Now I know that it's overly simplified and it really doesn't develop into the relatedness continuum, which is one of the reasons why it is so flat, but it gets at the basic thing that occurs in a narcissistic personality. Likewise, you'll notice in the second diagram there, B, we have a borderline personality. The primary thing that they do is that they fear abandonment, which would be extreme hunger and need for someone else. They fear that so much that they go all the way to the other side and they act like they are in control of everything and they have to try to merge with others. Of course, we also know that they are very fluctuating in this. They become very afraid of that merger once they really have someone within their grasp, and then they often flee to the other side, which can be very disconcerting. Then they feel like they're starving and they feel like nothing will help anymore, and this can be just a manipulation, or it can be a manipulation that's sort of based on an extreme feeling that they have inside themselves. Either way, these kinds of disorders, as we all know, have a lot of influence in an interpersonal psychotherapy. So towards the bottom of that page, I have also diagrammed two kinds of obsessive compulsive. We have, if you look at diagram I and diagram J, you have an obsessive rigid type of person. That is the classic obsessive compulsive disorder. Well, not disorder, no. As a matter of fact, as you all know, obsessive compulsive disorder and obsessive compulsive personality disorder are very, very different things. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder being more, personality disorder having more to do with a need for perfectionism and doing things right as a way of protecting oneself, and the obsessive compulsive disorder being much more related specifically to compulsions and rituals. So anyway, we're talking about a personality disorder here. And you'll notice under I we have your typical obsessive compulsive personality disorder, the rigid type, who needs all things done a certain way. And you'll also notice when you work with these people that they are much more likely to express themselves in a relatively isolated way, which is where they stand on the relatedness continuum, that they hold themselves in an isolated way so that they can avoid the sense of responsibility fragmentation. The obsessive fragmented type of person, however, takes on many, many responsibilities all the time, doing everything they possibly can for everyone to avoid a feeling of isolation. Now, I try to depict the fact that these people are relatively healthy by making this third axis relatively short, which again leads to that confusion. This is based on the figure 1, which had the most extreme feelings towards the ends of the continuum. But of course, it would be, if it was on the diagram that had the interpsychic feelings towards the center, then of course these would be longer dotted lines. So I don't think we're going to have time to get into the histrionic and the passive-aggressive. You will notice that they have longer lines, but they are somewhat in the relatedness continuum. But I wanted to mention that with the obsessive-rigid type of person, you will often notice that they start questioning, or seem to be questioning in a relatively indirect way, whether you know what you're doing, whether this is exactly the right kind of therapy. And we always question these things because we really don't actually know for sure that we're doing exactly what is going to help the person most. So these things do lead to us questioning ourselves, as we actually should. And then at least my approach is to explain to them how my model would work, and I would give them an idea of knowing what it would be, and let them see if they, and also present to them what the other models are, and let them have their say on whether they want to come back or not. It really is completely up to them. But even the responsibility fragmented type has a certain way of projecting certain things. I think this type of person is quite frequently going to act like you may need their help, and these are all ways of diminishing their own feeling of isolation. And these things, the more you are developed into the relatedness continuum, by far the more complicated your issues become. I don't know if you all would agree with this, but to me, I'm not saying it's easier to work with people who have severe personality disorders, but at least in the problem that they have, the problem itself, in my opinion, is actually kind of simple. because it is so direct, and that's one of the reasons why it's so easily diagrammed. But the more depth you develop, the more facets to your personality, the more different you become. So I have a feeling that this third continua is the hardest one for any of you to agree with. And then, of course, there are other ways of feeling driven, like sex is a relatively driven state, and I would say that that could be diagrammed as well. It just doesn't happen to be, in my opinion, one of the three most important. I think that if you look at it closely, and you'll see that I have an article about this called "Sex is Not a Drive; It's Just Really Important." You will see that sex pretty much involves all three continua, because when we're expressing ourselves sexually, aggression gets involved, fear gets involved, hunger and desire and relatedness, they all get involved. And so to me, it's one of the reasons why it's so compelling, as it should be, is because it involves all of the drives to some extent, all the drives that I posit as being most important. So the things that you might feel with a fragmented type of obsessive compulsive personality, you could even, they use circumstantial speech a lot. A lot of times circumstantial speech will result in a sense of difficulty following and boredom, and to me this is a way of them staying all the way on their side, because they're afraid of our help. They're afraid of our help, partly because we might get there before they do to the answers, and partly because they don't want to start letting people in, and then they would have to perceive that person as another person who needs their help. The fragmented type, I think, perceives just about everybody as needing their help in some way, and they will do something for everyone. The more isolative type, or rigid type of obsessive compulsive, is much more likely to be completely acting independent, and actually to some extent they will to some extent use some narcissistic defenses. But the biggest difference, and I think that you will all see how this works, the biggest difference between people who are well-developed or not well-developed personality-wise is how much responsibility they take. People who are well-developed with respect to responsibility, they can be on their own, and they do need others, and they do share. The greater extent to which they're able to do that in a relatively flexible manner, the more healthy they are. And so that gives them the third dimension, as I mentioned earlier. So where a person who obsessive compulsive personality sometimes has difficulty is in allowing other people to be involved in their own actual needs. So even the fragmented type, they very rarely let anybody do anything for them, and the isolated type, or the rigid type, is very, very likely to just do everything themselves, or make people do things their way, and that makes them, they stay isolated, nobody wants to be around them, but it also helps them from becoming too responsibility fragmented, because they know that everything will be done just right, and therefore their world will not fall apart. Alright, so I was wanting to get a little bit into how this works with histrionics, and maybe even passive aggressive, but I don't think I'm going to get a chance to do that. I do want to say about both of those disorders that, in my opinion, histrionic personality disorder and passive aggressive personality disorder are extremely, extremely, extremely common, even more so than would be stated in the DSM-4. And so, in my opinion, that's just a matter of kind of seeing people's styles. So in a more active therapy, you're more likely to see a person's personality, and then you're more likely to be able to work with it. So I work with a lot of people who I believe, and this is actually true, especially responsibility fragmented people who are somewhat obsessive compulsive, but also histrionics. They have a really deep need to be special, and you can see them pulling for this in a therapy session. And so, you can do anything from mirroring that specialness to also pointing out how much they need it so they can use it interpersonally in their lives, and then even talk about how painful it must be not to have received it, because you usually have a good history and an understanding of what's happening in their lives. Passive aggressives, on the other hand, I guess I am getting a little bit into this because I'm trying to do it quickly. They think everything is unfair. They're somewhat developed interpersonally. They don't want to really affect other people negatively. That's why their desire to express their desires and their expressions of need are expressed indirectly, and quite often a lot of anger comes out of them because they don't feel like they get anything that they really need, or don't get the things that they really need. And of course, assertiveness helps with them quite a bit as well. As a matter of fact, I think assertiveness is largely the key. But you can feel with them this feeling of things being unfair. That's usually one of the first things that you feel interpersonally. And I think also that my diagram and my model help to understand that. I don't believe that I'm going to have time to go into how RST shows how each of the many different kinds of therapies work, but I do think it is helpful in that regard as well. And you can see, if you have my handout, you can see just my general way of saying that RST demonstrates usefulness even in other psychotherapies. All right, Noah. I am, of course, yes. It was a lot to do fast, that's for sure. I hope I didn't overwhelm people. Yeah. Not really. I am interested in plugging my book one more time, I suppose. This is a copy of the book, which people will have video, I guess, on your site after some time. And so this is a copy of the book. It's a really good book. My first book's really good too, but that's far more for clinicians specifically. Whereas this one, I think, really kind of bridges the gap between clinicians and patients, and I think it's extremely useful. My clients are finding it extremely useful. At least that's what they say. I'm hoping that they're being authentic in that statement. Right, and the latest book is available on my website. Great. Thank you. Yeah. I like it. Thank you very much. Thank you. No, I really enjoyed it. Yeah. I'm really interested in seeing what I look like on the video. I think it's interesting. I've been looking all over the room as I'm explaining because there's nothing to actually focus on. So I'm wondering what that's going to look like. We'll see. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's great. Take care.